The day had been long, filled with crowds, healings, and teachings that left both Jesus and his disciples physically exhausted but spiritually invigorated. The dusty roads of Galilee were crowded with people, men, women, and children from every corner of the region, who had come to see Jesus, hoping for a glimpse of a miracle, a touch of his hand, or a word of wisdom that might change their lives. As evening approached, Jesus and his disciples withdrew from the multitudes. They needed rest, but more than that, they needed time to reflect. The gentle hills overlooking the Sea of Galilee had always been a place of refuge for them, a place where they could sit in silence, talk openly, and learn from their master in the quiet of the twilight hours. Tonight, as the sun sank below the horizon, casting long shadows over the land, there was an unspoken tension among the disciples. Jesus noticed the heaviness in their spirits. Though they had walked with him for many months, witnessing miracles and hearing the mysteries of the kingdom of God, he knew that doubt still clung to their hearts. Even after seeing the dead raised to life, the blind given sight, and storms calmed with a word, the disciples often struggled to understand their own role in God's plan. They felt small, insignificant, and unworthy of the extraordinary calling that had been placed upon them. Peter especially felt the weight of his own inadequacy. Though bold and brash on the surface, Peter was deeply aware of his shortcomings. He remembered the moment when, full of faith, he had stepped out of the boat to walk on the water toward Jesus. For a few precious moments, he had felt the thrill of faith as his feet touched the surface of the sea. But just as quickly, fear had gripped him, and he began to sink, crying out for Jesus to save him. That moment haunted him, reminding him of his fragility. Was he truly worthy to lead? Could he really be the rock upon which Jesus would build his church? John, the disciple Jesus loved, also carried doubts of his own. He had always been close to Jesus, his heart overflowing with love for the Master. But there were times when he felt overwhelmed by the weight of being one of Jesus' closest followers. How could he ever live up to the example of the one he loved so deeply? Was his heart strong enough to bear the responsibilities that would come in the days ahead? The other disciples too carried their burdens. Andrew, James, Philip, Thomas, and the rest, all of them had moments when they questioned their worth, their strength, and their ability to fulfill the mission that Jesus had entrusted to them. They had left behind their nets, their families, their homes, but still they wondered, were they truly enough? Could they change the world? As they sat on the grassy hillside, the golden light of the setting sun reflecting off the waters of the Sea of Galilee, Jesus felt their uncertainty like a whisper in the wind. His heart was full of compassion for them. They had walked so far, learned so much, and yet they still carried the weight of doubt like a heavy stone around their necks. Jesus turned to them, his eyes filled with tenderness. He sat down on a large stone, motioning for his disciples to gather around him. The cool evening breeze ruffled their robes, and the sound of the distant waves washing against the shore created a soothing backdrop. "My dear friends," Jesus began, his voice gentle and full of love, "I see the questions in your hearts. I see the doubts that weigh you down, the fears that whisper to you in the quiet moments when you are alone. You wonder how you, ordinary men, can ever fulfill the extraordinary purpose that God has placed before you. You see the miracles I have done and you ask yourselves, how could I ever do the same? You feel small in the face of such great things, and you wonder if you are enough." The disciples lowered their heads, unable to meet his gaze. It was true. They had asked themselves those very questions many times. Despite their faith in Jesus, they often felt like mere children trying to understand the vastness of the universe. Peter's heart ached with the truth of it. He clenched his fists, frustrated with himself. He wanted so badly to be strong, to be the leader Jesus believed he could be, but there were so many moments when he felt like he was failing. How could he ever live up to the responsibility of being the rock? Jesus looked at Peter with a knowing smile, as if he could see straight into his heart. "Peter, do not be troubled," he said softly. "You are more than you know. And you are not alone in feeling this way." Turning to the rest of the disciples, Jesus continued, "Let me tell you a story. The disciples looked up, their eyes full of curiosity. They had heard Jesus tell many stories, each one filled with deep meaning and hidden truths. Whenever he spoke in parables, it was as if the veil between heaven and earth was lifted, and they could see a glimpse of God's kingdom. "There was once a little bird," Jesus began, his voice carrying a gentle rhythm, "who lived high in the branches of a great tree in a vast and beautiful forest. Every day the little bird would perch on its branch and watch the world around it. The bird admired the other creatures of the forest, the mighty eagles who soared high above the treetops, their wings spread wide as they glided effortlessly through the sky. The bird marveled at the swift deer that ran through the forest with grace, their legs moving so fast they seemed to barely touch the ground. And the bird listened in awe to the roar of the lions, whose voices echoed through the valleys, filling the forest with their powerful presence." As Jesus spoke, the disciples could almost see the scene unfolding before them. They could imagine the little bird, perched on a high branch, watching the world with wide eyes, filled with awe and admiration for the strength and beauty of the creatures around it. But the little bird, Jesus continued, felt very small and insignificant. "I am so small," the bird thought to itself. "I cannot soar as high as the eagles, nor run as fast as the deer. I cannot roar like the lions. What am I compared to these great creatures? I am just a little bird with small wings and a tiny voice. I could never do anything important." The disciples felt a pang of sympathy for the little bird. They too had often felt small and insignificant in the presence of greatness. They had walked with Jesus, the Son of God, and yet they often wondered if they were worthy to be in his presence. Could they ever live up to the calling he had placed upon them? "One day," Jesus said, his voice growing a bit more solemn, "a terrible storm swept through the forest. The winds howled and the rain fell in heavy sheets, turning the ground to mud. The great trees that had stood tall for hundreds of years began to sway and creak under the force of the storm. Their branches bent and broke, and the animals of the forest fled in fear, seeking shelter wherever they could find it. Even the mighty eagles, who soared so high in the sky, struggled to stay aloft in the wind. The swift deer, who could outrun any predator, could not outrun the storm. And the lions, whose roars had once filled the forest, were silent as they cowered beneath the trees. The disciples could feel the intensity of the storm as Jesus described it. The wind whipping through the trees, the rain pouring down, the fear that must have gripped the animals as they tried to survive. They could imagine the little bird, trembling on its branch, feeling powerless in the face of such a terrifying force. "The little bird," Jesus continued, "was perched high in its tree, clinging to a branch as the wind whipped through its feathers. The bird trembled with fear, feeling so small and helpless. It watched as the storm tore through the forest, toppling trees and scattering the animals. For hours the storm raged and the little bird wondered if it would ever end. But eventually the storm passed, leaving the forest in ruins. The once majestic trees were broken, their branches scattered across the ground. The nests of the birds were destroyed, and the animals were left without shelter. The disciples sat in silence, feeling the weight of the story. They had experienced their own storms, moments of doubt, fear, and uncertainty when it seemed like everything was falling apart. They knew what it felt like to be powerless in the face of forces beyond their control. "The little bird," Jesus said softly, looked around at the devastation and felt a deep sorrow. Its home was gone, and the forest it had once known was in ruins. For a moment the bird felt hopeless. It was so small after all. What could it possibly do to help? It wasn't strong like the lions or fast like the deer or powerful like the eagles. It was just a little bird with small wings. But then something stirred within the bird's heart. Jesus paused, letting the words sink in. The disciples leaned forward, hanging on his every word. "The little bird," Jesus continued, "realized that it had something to offer, even if it wasn't as strong or as powerful as the other creatures. It had its wings. It had its courage. And so, the little bird fluttered down from its branch and began to gather small twigs and leaves. It worked tirelessly, rebuilding its nest one twig at a time. As it worked, other birds saw what the little bird was doing and were inspired by its courage. One by one they began to join in, each bird gathering what it could to rebuild the forest. Soon the entire forest was alive with the sound of birds working together, each one doing its part to restore what had been lost. The disciples could see it in their minds. The little bird, working diligently despite its small size, and the other birds, inspired by its example, joining together to rebuild the forest. It was a beautiful image of hope, of perseverance, of the power of even the smallest creatures to make a difference. And so, Jesus said, his voice filled with warmth, the forest was healed, not by the strength of the lions or the speed of the deer, but by the courage of a small, seemingly insignificant bird who believed it could make a difference. There was a long silence after Jesus finished speaking. The disciples were deeply moved, their hearts stirred by the simple yet profound truth of the story. Some of them had tears in their eyes, while others sat quietly reflecting on the meaning of the tale. Jesus looked at each of them with great love and tenderness. "Do you see, my friends?" he asked softly. "It is not the size of your wings or the strength of your hands that matters. It is the courage in your heart, the faith that you carry, and the love that you give. You may feel small and unworthy, but God does not measure you by the standards of the world. He sees the power that lies within you, the power of His Spirit. You do not need to be strong like the lions or fast like the deer. You need only believe in the power that God has placed within you." Peter, who had been sitting quietly, his head bowed, lifted his eyes to meet Jesus' gaze. His heart was full of emotion, gratitude, awe, and a deep sense of unworthiness. He had doubted himself so many times, questioned whether he could ever live up to the calling Jesus had placed upon him. But now, hearing the story of the little bird, something shifted inside him. "Master," Peter said, his voice trembling with emotion, "I understand now. It is not about being the strongest or the best. It is about trusting in you, believing that with your help, I can do what you have called me to do. I may be small, but with you, I know I can make a difference." Jesus smiled at Peter, his eyes shining with love. "Yes, Peter," he said gently. "You can. And you will." The other disciples too felt their hearts lifted by the story. John, who had always been close to Jesus, realized that his love for the Master was enough, that he didn't need to be anything more than who he already was. James and Andrew, Philip and Thomas, and the rest of the disciples felt the same. They had been carrying the weight of their own doubts for so long, but now, they saw that it wasn't their strength or ability that mattered. It was their faith, their willingness to trust in God's power working through them. Jesus stood up, looking out over the sea, the stars beginning to twinkle in the darkening sky. The air was cool and fresh, and the world felt still as if it were holding its breath. "My beloved friends," Jesus said, turning back to the disciples, "never doubt the power that God has placed within you. You may feel small, but with faith you can move mountains. You may feel weak, but with love, you can heal the brokenhearted. You may feel unworthy, but with courage you can change the world." The disciples nodded, their hearts full of renewed purpose and hope. They no longer felt the weight of doubt and fear. They understood now that they were enough, not because of their own strength but because of the power of God working through them. Jesus smiled at them one last time before beginning the evening prayers, his voice filled with the same love and encouragement that had carried them through every storm. "Remember," he said, "you are never too small to make a difference. The kingdom of God is not built by the mighty, but by those who trust in the strength of God within them. You are enough just as you are." And with that, the disciples bowed their heads, filled with peace, knowing that no matter what storms came their way, they carried within them the courage of the little bird and the strength of God's love. The disciples departed that place, their spirits lifted and their hearts filled with the profound truth that Jesus had shared. As they walked together into the night, the stars above them twinkling like beacons of hope, they knew that they were ready for the journey ahead. They no longer saw themselves as inadequate or unworthy. They understood now that their power did not come from their own abilities, but from their faith in God and the love they carried within their hearts. And so they went out into the world, not as ordinary men, but as empowered followers of Christ, ready to bring the message of love, hope, and faith to all who needed it. And in their hearts, they carried the story of the little bird, a reminder that even the smallest acts of faith and courage can bring healing to a broken world. This was their calling. This was their purpose. And with Jesus by their side, they knew they were enough. This is end of the story. Please like this video and subscribe this channel for more Jesus story like this. May the God watch over you.